for anybody who would like to share an Uber or a taxi or etc. So you can go sign up with your name and your email, and then there will be an email sent around for all of you to get in contact. I'm going to hand it over to Wolf.
This was so lovely to hear another voice, much more lovely than mine, with all these technical announcements. So we want to proceed with our next panel, and I'm very grateful to have Patrick James as our chair today from International Relations. He was, like Carol Weiss yesterday, they both made it happen that the International Relations contributed as a co-sponsor to the conference. So some of you flew on their money, just to say this. Okay, so I hand over to Patrick, who will introduce himself briefly.
Thank you very much, Wolf. Am I coming through on this? It's all good? Yes, I served as director of our Center for International Studies here at USC for 9 years and have an ongoing interest in identity, politics, and conflict. And I'm currently teaching a course on comparative genocide. In terms of my own bio, very short, I have been working on international relations and comparative political systems for about 35 years and will serve as president of the International Studies Association in the years 2018-19. So enough about me. We have some pretty interesting speakers here, and our format is simple. I'll introduce each speaker in turn. They will go to a maximum of 20 minutes each, and our speakers prefer that questions are held until both of them have finished. One quick announcement, because I teach at 12:30, I must leave at 12:20. I'm sorry, I will have to leave a little before the end. So our first speaker then, Morna Macleod, Latin American Studies, State Autonomous University of Morelos, Mexico, has an extraordinary career. She is a researcher and lecturer in the postgraduate program in social science at that school. She has a master's and doctorate in Latin American Studies from UNAM. Her MA thesis is comparative study on political repression in Chile and Guatemala. She was a human rights worker, first with Chile from London and then with Guatemala from Mexico in the late 1970s and early 1980s. She lived in Guatemala from 1995 to 2001. Her publications are quite extraordinary and include Development or Devastation, Epistemologies of Mayan Women's Resistance to an Open Pit Gold Mine in Guatemala, published in a leading journal in New Zealand. She has numerous other publications, including one quite prominent one in Flasco, Guatemala, 2011. There are many other good things on this resume, and I could go on forever, as I could about our other speaker. She's currently working on multiple violence in Morelos, Mexico. Please join me in welcoming Professor Morna Macleod.
Hi, can you hear me? If I speak too quickly, let me know. Your coffee. And I want to just take the time to thank the Shoah Foundation. This, to me, is an extraordinary event because it's not just academic. It's about human lives, and it's about long-term trajectories, and it's about resistance and surviving. So I just wanted to thank you. And I feel very blessed being here. So I'm just going to talk briefly about the radical fragments of history, taking this idea from Benjamin, very briefly about the Rios Montt period, testimonies very briefly, and I want to really concentrate on human rights reports written in the early 80s from different actors in the international community, and then spend time on final reflections. So if I'm getting behind, I really want to get to those final reflections. Thanks. So this idea of radical fragments of history is the idea that we have to document. That it's what Freddie was saying yesterday. Many people are elderly survivors. If we don't document now, history can get lost. So this idea of trying to save and try to document things around the genocide. I will be talking about the international community. I want to say in Guatemala during the early 80s, there were no human rights commissions, you know, because that was simply too dangerous. There was one attempt and people were killed. So what happened is that the main place for Guatemalan human rights commissions was Mexico, with the Justice and Peace Commission and the Guatemala Human Rights Commission, which is where I collaborated with. There are also parts of these Guatemalan organizations in the States, in Costa Rica. And where I'm speaking from is that I work with the Guatemala Human Rights Commission, and I often interpreted for international delegations. For example, Lord Colville of Culross, who was the UN Special Rapporteur, Lord Avebury, when they were in Mexico. And this is important because I heard the witnesses, and then when you see the reports, we'll talk about that later, sometimes somewhat surprising. And I'm interested in reading these reports that are now 30 years old. So 30 years down the track gives you a very different reading. And I wanted to see how genocide was framed and also use a gender and race lens. So that's the kind of focus I went to looking at these things. But I want to start, but mainly, yes, I've said that. I just want to say, Sophia talked yesterday about the Plan Sofia, but we're also talking about in the wider Rios Montt 15 months. We're talking about the National Security and Development Plan. We're talking about the Victory Campaign in 1982, which were the massacres in scorched earth. We're talking about the civil patrols. We're talking about beans and rifles, frijoles y fusiles, this whole idea of killing and then economic support, homework and food, techo, trabajo y, I don't know what that T is. And the Tribunales de Fuero Especial that saved Marvin's life yesterday. He talked about that. And just to reiterate that about 20,000 people were killed in 15 months. So I want to start with a testimony by Carmelita Santos. I never actually met her, but she made such an impact on my life. I was at the FEDEFAM conference in Mexico City, and she said, and it still accompanies me to this day, pero ¿por qué nos matan así como chuchos? Why do they kill us like dogs? But she also said, I think these massacres are worse for women, because first the women are raped, and after raping her, they pull out her tongue, they pull out her eyes, they tear away her breasts, and afterwards they just leave her dying there. Many times we have said, witnessing such terrible suffering, that we would prefer it if they simply shot us, but not to be killed this way. And at the Permanent People's Tribunal, she said, and I'm quoting these to show how she had such a consciousness of gender, of ethnicity, and of collectivity as indigenous people. So she says, I want to speak in the name of all the men, women, children, and elders in my village, so that the world hears of the injustice we're suffering, and that we have the recognized right that to live on the land and as children of God. And they've treated us in Guatemala, us indigenous people, she's saying, as if we were stupid Indians. That's not the case. We have the same capacities, but we don't have the opportunity to study. They tell us we indigenous are worthless and that we're a nuisance for Guatemala. And I just want to briefly mention with testimony, there's testimony like Carmelita Santos, who made such an impression on me because she was talking in the middle of the massacres. This is what's happening now in Guatemala. Put a stop to it, you know, that. And very little has been theorized about that particular moment of witnessing. And then the secondary witnesses like Ricardo Falla, who alas can't be here, but documenting very meticulously, and I'll see one of his reports. But delegation reports are also forms of witness. But most of the academic literature that there is are around truth commissions, trials, and ethical tribunals. So, this first early stage of witnessing while things are happening and denouncing is kind of missing. So, and there's also the whole literary genre, like Rigoberta Menchú, etc. And so I just want to, maybe it's my ignorance, but if anyone knows about theorizing on testimony while things are happening, if you could let me know. This idea that Shoshana Feldman talks about with Zola in the Dreyfus affair of j'accuse, I accuse the Guatemalan army. That is what I haven't found theorization about. And instead of massacres, it's interesting to see scorched earth. So this photograph is extremely powerful. But what I really want to talk about are the reports. So I won't be able to talk in length about all of them, but there's Amnesty International 1981, Guatemala, a government program of political murder, Oxfam America, Witness to Political Violence in Guatemala, which I haven't been able to find the original copy, and I found it in Polémica. I'll show you later. Ricardo Falle's book of the Finca de San Francisco, which I think is the first detailed massacre, and I'll come back to that. The Segup in Guatemala City, made up of Guatemalan exiles, is very interesting. Lots have no dates. This is around 1983. Trocare, which is an Irish aid agency, a delegation that went to Guatemala. The UN Special Rapporteur report, which I translated for in Mexico for the rapporteur. And then the British Parliamentary Human Rights Group, Bitter and Cruel, 1984, and the Guatemala Human Rights Commission Disappeared Campaign report. So the Amnesty report it's interesting because it's very careful, very understated. For example, it talks about 21 Indian peasants who died in the Spanish embassy. No mention of massacre. It does talk about victims of the state violence, church, trade unions, university professionals, etc. But the vast majority were the urban poor and peasantry. Again, very little mention of indigenous people. Sorry, I say here no mention of indigenous people, and it says Indian peasants up above. So I'm sorry, that's not quite right. But it's mainly about peasantry. And no mention of massacres. And you think in 1981, Panzos in 78, there were a lot of massacres had taken place. The Oxfam America Witness to Political Violence is very interesting because it came out in the Polémica, which I'll mention in a minute. But they're the testimonies of 7 foreign professionals, mostly from the United States, living in rural Guatemala. And the emphasis is documenting rural daily life and the effects of violence. So there's a couple that work on literacy, a Protestant ministry, 2 Catholic priests, a health worker, a Peace Corps volunteer, a researcher, and an exiled priest who's not from the States. And Polémica, there's 10 minutes, thank you. And, I have to go quickly. And Polémica was a revista that was produced in Costa Rica with Edelberto Torres Rivas, Aguilera, and, a lot of people that were in exile. And so it's very interesting. I found it in here, and I want to say that there are different visions in these testimonies, but all of them talk about the disruption of rural daily life and the growing extreme poverty, of how political violence brings about more poverty. There's a lot of mention of indigenous, even the word Mayan, which in 1982 was very uncommon, Mayan culture, and even a mention of peoples, indigenous peoples. And that is very interesting so many years later, because that wasn't common. Very little mention of women. A lot of specific denunciations of specific cases, torture, disappearance, rape, that's where the women come in, and killings. And the idea of the army teaching the Indians a lesson. And the anger, ensuing repression, motivating indigenous women and men to join the guerrillas. This is what comes through these reports. And what was interesting was that I have to say this. I read something about this report, and Oxfam GB, where I worked for many years, but at the beginning they did not want this report to be published. But when their own workers and counterparts started being killed in Guatemala, they said to Oxfam America, publish it. So that's an interesting little side. Then I want to mention the massacre of the Finca San Francisco that was so carefully documented by Ricardo, the Jesuit priest Ricardo Falla. It's, I believe, the first rigorously documented in-depth account of a massacre. And in the book, he presents a chart, and the chart has, in the 4.5 first months of Rios Montt, 19 massacres, apart from the Finca de San Francisco, 32 communities, 2,507 people massacred, this excluding the San Francisco, mainly indigenous, and the massacres that had taken place in Quiché, 10, 3 in Huehuetenango, 3 in Alta Verapaz, 2 in Petén, 1 in Chimaltenango, and 1 in Baja Verapaz. But he decides, rather than try to have everything, he wants to concentrate on one, so he goes to the refugee camps in Chiapas, and he interviews at length with helpers, assistant researchers, 2 survivors. So the 302 names, the names of massacred Chuch Indian women, men, and children. The massacre took place on the 17th of July, 1982. The first mention was in in Mexico, in August of the same year. And there was a detailed report in the New York Times in October. So, sorry, I already said that. And the report came out in September 83. A few mentions of rape of women. And he also talks about most of the perpetrators being indigenous conscripted soldiers. One of the most fascinating documents I found was the SEGUP, which is the Comité Guatemalteco de Unidad Patriótica, Alto al Genocidio de un Pueblo en Lucha. And so the SEGUP lasted for about 2 years. I think it was based in Mexico City, or in Mexico, sorry. 60 professional Guatemalans in exile. And it's one of the most critical reports, and it talks about indigenous peoples, it talks about genocide, it talks about rape of women, dreadful mutilations and killings of children and pregnant women. It refers to various international reports to validate their own denunciations as Guatemalans, and it cites the Popol Vuh. Another report that's very interesting is Trocare, which is this Irish aid agency. The delegation was in 1983, headed by a bishop. A lot of mention of indigenous people. It talks specifically of genocide, massacres, and scorched earth. So, two quotes. The victims have included many thousands of ordinary peasants and workers, the majority of them of Indian communities, political and trade union leaders, academics, university students, priests, nuns, development workers, and thousands of catechists. Little on women, though the army routinely rapes the women before killing them, and even pregnant women and young girls are not spared. The report that most horrified me was Lord Colville's. As I said, I interpreted for him these terrible testimonies of indigenous women and men. And he starts off, and this is the UN report, so imagine the weight that this has. The Guatemalan government welcome proved indeed to be genuine. I found all doors open, a willingness, frankly, to discuss all aspects of what is undoubtedly a daunting experience. So he buys into the military narrative. To eliminate the guerrillas, that's a good thing according to him, including support from Mayan communities, and the development of indigenous peasants, recognizing the negligence and the abandon, which was very much part of the military discourse at the time. And then he has this extraordinary quote, says this extraordinary thing. He says, "It's a well-known fact that the indigenous people listen in silence so long as they agree with the speaker, but soon interrupt if they disagree," which I find very bizarre. So implicit in his report is that there's a crossfire analysis, like David Stoll, Laborde. So he also, there's no mention, we're talking about the report being published in November of 83. There's no mention of massacres. He denies scorched earth. He does talk about the model villages and resettlement camps, but as a way of saving internally displaced people. Women are mentioned twice in the entire report. And what I want to bring as a gender analysis is Lord Colville's own gender, race, class, and nation and organizational UN privilege. The authoritative voice. How many? 5, thank you. And how influential and how detrimental his report was. Because when I compared Chile with Guatemala, Chile had so much support. The special rapporteur was never allowed into Chile. And here we have the UN, instead, for me, a very biased report. So he finishes saying, I therefore must recommend the international community to look with benevolence on the newest set of progressive initiatives, and he's talking about the military, and to recognize the signs of a sincere intention to fulfill them. So here we have Lord Colville, and here we have Lord Avebury. Anyone from Britain will know that Lord Avebury was the human rights lord. He just died like last year. So they decided in this report, if you see it says GCHR copy, that's the Guatemala Human Rights Commission in London. James Painter accompanied Lord Avebury on the delegation with other parliamentarians. It's very interesting. There was a conservative, Lord Avebury was a liberal, and there was a Labour MP. So they wrote this report, Bitter and Cruel. So I started thinking, and I thought, is this related? And I wrote to James Painter, and he said yes, but it was an indirect reply to Lord Colville's report. So this report was very important, but there was a particular emphasis on urban and rural political repression and poverty, but an astonishing lack of mention of indigenous. Usually, indigenous people, they're usually referred to as peasants. So there's some mention of cultural markers, dress, language, no mention of genocide, very little mention of women, more visibility of church identities. And that, there was a huge repression of church. So that is important. But there's a vast critique on model villages, scorched earth, massacres, eviction of indigenous peasants for agro-export crops, a lot on poverty, and testimonies that do include racism and massacres. The last report, this will be very quick. This was the Human Rights Commission, and I just want to say this was a letter campaign for the disappeared. There were 100 cases of disappeared people, 81 letters, at least 5 were women, but we don't know more because their names like Encarnacion, that could be women or men. Only one mention of an indigenous man because he was monolingual, but 31 with one or both surnames and other surnames like Mateo. Oh, no. So I just want to show you. Oh, no. That's exactly what I didn't want to do. Okay, so there's the final reflections. 30 years later, okay, I'll jump this. Racism is rarely mentioned, indigenous people more so. Women primarily mentioned as being raped and or killed or widows. Class comes up constantly, especially poverty. But most of all, the right to life and denouncing horror. And I just wanted to mention that with Primo Levi, the idea of the gray zone, this is too complicated. What I'm trying to say is that instead of in concentration camps, it's actually in model villages and in communities where fear is a way of survival. So there's this resistance, but there's also the impact of fear. And the lessons learned are not to generalize. The need for more situated local studies, like what Sergio Palencia talked about yesterday, and taking the moment of time into consideration. It's not the same 1978, 1981, etc. And finally, genocide is mentioned in some of the reports, not in all. And I just want to put a hypothesis forward. There'd just been the Permanent People's Tribunal in Madrid in 1983, and there's the idea of peoples as sovereignty. And so I want to suggest that there's another actual take on the meaning of genocide as different from the legal meaning that it took in the Rios Montt trial, and that there's a broad space for understanding genocide from different perspectives and not just from a legal perspective. And that's all. Thank you. Maltioschiwe.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure now to introduce our other very outstanding speaker for today. We have next Susanne Jonas of the Latin American and Latino Studies, University of California, Santa Cruz. She is an internationally recognized scholar of Latin America, particularly Guatemala and Central America, for nearly 5 decades. She was on the faculty of the Latin American and Latino Studies Department at the University of California, Santa Cruz for 24 years and received a distinguished teaching award there. Since the 1990s, she has become a specialist on Guatemalan and Central American migration. Most recently, she's a co-author with Nestor Rodriguez of Guatemala, U.S. Migration, Transforming Regions off University of Texas Press 2 years ago. Among her 20 previous books of Centaurs and Doves, Guatemala's Peace Process, that was designated a 2001 Choice Outstanding Book, academic book as well. Regarding genocide in Guatemala, she has collaborated with the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and has contributed the Guatemala chapter for Centuries of Genocide, co-edited with Samuel Totten and William Parsons, 2019-2013, and an upcoming new edition. Please join me in welcoming Susanne Jonas.
I'm not. I barely can. You barely see me over the. So, I wanted to. So this is about key social actor against state war crimes, Guatemalan refugees and migrants in the United States. And I just wanted to thank the Shoah Foundation for doing this for Guatemala. It is so important. I'm going to begin with a case that happened in the 1990s called Xuncas versus Gramajo. This was in the spring of 1991. I got a phone call from the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York regarding General Gramajo. He was a former defense minister from 1987 to 1990, and the chief staff 1986-87, and more to the point, at the height of the counterinsurgency war during 1982 and 83, he was the chief military commander of 7 Highlands Mayan departments or provinces in Guatemala. But by academic year 1991, he had a USAID fellowship to get his master's degree at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. It was very widely believed that Washington thought he would be an excellent president, and so they wanted him to become more legitimate. Regardless of his prior history, so the Center for Constitutional Rights was looking for people who would file a lawsuit against him while he was in the United States. I referred them to the UC Davis Immigration Law Clinic and its director, James Smith. As Smith recounted to me later on, he initiated a meeting in the basement of the law school with a number of Cancobal Mayas who were living near Davis and Sacramento. While they were survivors of massacres and other war crimes during that period, and he put it to them very bluntly. He said, look, there could be reprisals against your relatives who are still in Guatemala if you want to do this. About 24 people came to the meeting, and some of them came forward immediately, but he said, no, you need to think about this. and he scheduled a meeting for a few days later, and they came back even more determined with the quote that he gave me about them: "If this means that Gramajo will never again be in a position of power, we have to do it." So this was, more people came the second time, and that was the beginning of the case Shunkat versus Gramajo, in which 8 Cancobalmayas plus one other plaintiff brought charges against the general. It was the spirit of hope and determination and courage that we heard from Rosalina last night and from Marvin Perez. The charges by the plaintiffs described unspeakable crimes, mostly as part of village massacres. The overall argument was that Gramajo had ordered and directed the strategy that led to the massacres and war crimes and what was later called acts of genocide in the Mayan highlands, and could be held liable for extreme abuses and crimes committed by officers and soldiers under his command. That was the basic case. Shortly thereafter, Diana Ortiz, an American nun, filed charges against him as well for the torture that she underwent when he was Minister of Defense. As he was standing in line to receive his Harvard master's degree, he was served with a subpoena by the CCR lawyers. That was a great moment. And a couple of days later, when he was packing to go home to Guatemala, by Diana Ortiz's lawyer. And he did not respond, and so the court basically ruled that since he did not challenge the plaintiff's charges, the court accepts them as true. During 1992 and 93, the CCR proceeded to go on and around the question of damages. And basically, Gramajo said, well, he didn't have a penny to his name. The judge ordered a $47.5 million payment to the Cancobales and to Diana, and a total of $47.5 million. Basically, he said he couldn't pay a thing. The CCR lawyers did go to the State Department and the INS and the Attorney General of the United States, and was able to make him excludable from the United States from any further entry on the grounds that he had engaged in genocide, terrorism, and crimes of moral turpitude. So, although they received no compensation, the plaintiffs, who were poor Cancobal-Maya asylum seekers, did have the moral and political victory in that battle and became central to the political narrative about the Guatemalan Civil War. The judgments came just as Guatemala's 1995 presidential election was in full swing, and thanks in large part to this international disgrace, Gramajo's candidacy received a whopping 1.17% of the vote. And that was the end of his political career. You wonder what, he died in 2004, but you wonder what might have happened if he were alive today. So this is a clear and dramatic example of U.S.-based Guatemalan refugees taking direct action against a military war criminal. Such opportunities have not been common, but in lower profile ways, large-scale populations of Guatemalan refugee asylum seekers and migrants displaced to the United States have played a strategic role in supporting the struggles of internal Guatemalan communities to expose these war crimes and acts of genocide and to get justice. The second part of my presentation is a little bit more about the importance of the migrant communities and refugees in the United States. In our recent book, which is this, for those of you who might be interested, I have a few flyers. My colleague Nestor Rodriguez, who is the co-author, traces the gradual build-up and at times rapid explosion of Guatemalan migration from 1977, when it became first significant, through 2011. According to the Migration Policy Institute, using official U.S. Census statistics, Guatemalans have become the 10th largest of all national origin groups in the United States. And the total was over 900,000 Guatemalans by 2014. The Guatemalan government gives higher figures. The stream of Guatemalans coming here first became important in the late 1970s and increased during the 80s, coinciding with the intensification of the civil war in the Mayan highlands, the village massacres, and the disappearances and other crimes against individuals, both Maya and Latino, in the cities. And since the 1980s, the presence of these migrants and refugees, together with those of Salvadorans, have helped create large U.S. grassroots support movements that I'll talk about for a second. Churches and cities, counties declared themselves sanctuary, protecting asylum seekers from U.S. immigration officials seeking to deport them. Together with movements opposing U.S. intervention in Central America, they influenced U.S. public opinion to the point that Congress and eventually presidents were no longer able to fully support the Guatemalan regimes, and that includes the government of Ronald Reagan, who was a cheerleader for Rios Montt, but he was barred by congressional legislation from sending them direct military assistance. The influence of Guatemalan refugee organizations in the United States helped put the Guatemalan government more sharply under the glare of world opinion. Princeton professor Alejandro Portes, who talks about the transnationalization of the Guatemalan conflict, taking it out of the protected space of state sovereignty. He also relies on these migrants, he refers to them as transnational actors, impacting Guatemala internally, and I would add, influencing international opinion through their presence, their messages, and their stories. One element that contributed to their higher profile was the unique history of Salvadoran Guatemalans who were very proactive in response to the Reagan administration's denial of 98% of Guatemalan asylum petitions during the 80s and 97% of Salvadorans. The Guatemalans and Salvadorans, together with their legal supporters, organized a campaign, a class action lawsuit called ABC versus Thornburg, who was the Attorney General under the G.W.H. Bush administration in the early 90s. And what the Justice Department and the INS, which was part of it at the time, was forced to settle this out of court if they didn't want to lose it, and to allow that all of the people who applied for ABC status could have their cases reheard on an individual basis. And 250,000 of them registered, and they were later folded into a piece of legislation called NACARA, which I can talk about during the question period if people are interested in the details of that. It folded in the ABC people and gave them not the special treatment of automatic legalization that Cubans and Nicaraguans got, but it gave them slightly less unfavorable treatment than the 1996 very harsh laws provided for. And interestingly enough, most of the ABC NACAR cases were not heard until the early 2000s, but when they were, most of them were won. So most of those people were able to legalize themselves in the United States. So to carry out this organizing campaign, they had to be very highly networked and organized. Especially the Salvadorans are known for their very high level of proactivity. And the Guatemalans, by working with them and with their legal supporters and law firms that provided pro bono assistance and support organizations in the United States, also participated very actively. This entire history and level of activity has kept alive the mega-narrative about what occurred during the wars in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, and I think that a lot of what I'm saying here, I'm targeting it to the United States, but it's not any less true of Canada or Europe, although the number of people in the United States does make it different. And even during the peace negotiations, to end the Civil War, U.S.-based Guatemalan communities made up largely of victims of army brutality helped to delegitimate the army in international opinion, and this may have contributed to limiting amnesty for war criminals in the 1994 and 96 mandates for the creation of the Commission of Historical Clarification and the Truth Commission. It became a basis for nearly 2 decades later. It opened the doors for the Rios Montt trial. And I should just add that testimony for the Truth Commission report was taken from U.S. migrants and refugees. So, as Rosalina emphasized, the peace accords have made a big difference, a huge difference. I mean, I spent 10 years trying to make that argument in my previous book, and many people were rather unbelievable about it. So, I think the one other thing I want to add is that U.S.-based support groups have played a very important role working with the refugees and migrants. There's one called NISGUA, the Network in Support of the People of Guatemala, that has been very active in bringing speakers from the various massacres. And their speaker this fall is a woman who is participated in the Sepulcro trial about sexual violence and domestic and sexual slavery, which is just one of the most historic trials ever. So there's other organizations, the decades-old Guatemalan Scholars Network, and others, but I think it's just important to mention the allies of the Guatemalans. So many of the scholars, many of you here, had studied massacres in Guatemala, but also worked in your home communities with refugees and migrants. And so I think that, and in some cases, that was even the inspiration. So at the local level here in Los Angeles, there was, according to the book by Nora Hamilton and Norma Chinchilla about the Guatemalans in Los Angeles, a 1989 Guatemalan Human Rights Tribunal was held with direct sponsorship of LA city officials. The authors say, well, although the tribunal received little media coverage in the United States, it was widely publicized in Guatemala. The last thing I wanted, the second to last that I want to just mention, since you all, I'll do it briefly because Dos Eres has been so much mentioned here already, and you all got to see the movie, and this is a big fast forward now. This is a 21st century version, a twist on the roles of Guatemalan migrants and refugees living in the United States and Canada, both the victims and the victimarios. It reinforces the central point of my presentation, that part of the sequel to the war crimes and acts of genocide and playing out among Guatemalans displaced by the war in other countries has repercussions for some of the war crimes trials now being held in Guatemala. In recent years, those began since 2008, and although they were not, there was not, to my knowledge, any testimony by U.S. migrants and refugees in the Rios Montt trial. Nevertheless, in the case of Dos Eres, it's been quite important. You all saw that, some of the victimarios were living in the United States with citizenship because they lied on their citizenship applications, not mentioning their role in war crimes in Guatemala. And in the case of the Dos Eres, the two survivors who were young boys, Oscar and Ramiro, have both played an important role in testifying against the victimarios. And I think that, how this, was a really important part of and some of the victimarios were ordinary soldiers. Some of them, if they were undocumented, they were deported back to Guatemala, where some of them are standing trial even as we speak in the Dos Eres trial. Those who had committed immigration felonies are awaiting trial here in the United States. And so, as you know, Oscar testified at the trial of Sosa Orantes in California and is going to testify in future trials. And as of 1 month ago in August, very, very, very recently, this is this August, we read that Ramiro has come forward saying he's willing to go to Guatemala to testify against a former Guatemalan soldier, Santos Lopez Alonso, who was deported from Los Angeles to Guatemala on August 10th of this year, just now. And Ramiro, the trial is scheduled to begin in December, and Ramiro is going to go to Guatemala to testify. I think one of the things one of the survivors of Dos Eres, he has said, I had to live to be the voice of those who didn't. He also testified against another soldier here in the United States who was one of the immigration fraud soldiers. And they are doing time in U.S. jails, the two that did that. They will be deported back to Guatemala when the 10 years expires. So we'll see what's happening 10 years from now. So just a few final reflections. I think we're talking about transnational justice, and it's taken a new meaning in the 21st century with the role of these refugees, asylees, and migrants as the line between what it means to be in Guatemala and what it means to be in the United States has kind of become blurred because of technological changes and because of this whole narrative of, the buildup of the participation. I think it's not people in one space go to another space, and the line of where you are is not what it used to be. And this is true also of people who are in Europe, and this is played out in different locales. And I think that there are examples from our presenters right here. Freddie Pesarelli coming to the United States to take testimony from Oscar, the survivor from Dos Eres, and Marvin Perez, who told us his story last night, who carried out his struggle for justice in Guatemala from Los Angeles, and unfailingly. So I think that these stories that Guatemalans and immigrants and refugees bring with them do not necessarily die. It depends on the will of the individual, as Marvin talked about last night. And those who want to participate do participate. Those who want to start a new life do start a new life. But I think if they have the desire to keep pushing to tell their stories, they are doing it. And I think they need to be recognized as part of the whole narrative of justice seeking in Guatemala. Thank you.
We have time available for questions, so I would ask you raise your hand, and when you rise to speak, we can pass this microphone around to people. Pass it back, please. Sure. So remember where you are. Please, initial show of hands. Keep them up for a moment. I'm going to take you in the order in which I recognize you. Remember your number. 1 in the pink in the back, 2 in the black just in front, 3, 4, 5, 6, and anyone else at the beginning? 7. Sorry about that. Please remember where you are and let us know who you are, and pass the mic on to the next speaker after your question. Thanks to our wonderful speakers.
Hi, to Professor Macleod. I was wondering when I was listening to your talk about the importance of language and how to name things. Like, for example, in the first report, you were mentioning that 21 people died, not a massacre, so that changed almost the meaning that it has. So I was thinking then about the importance in something to be called as genocide, as you said at the end. So what do you think language matters, or how do you think it can change and shape things?
Okay, we're going to take a few questions, say the first 3, and then our panelists will respond to those.
No, con respecto a lo que decía Norman sobre un poco la ausencia de historias o de trabajo de mujeres en los documentos, pero creo que también allí lo que pasa que no se le dio como cobertura al papel que ejercíamos las mujeres en Guatemala, porque somos mujeres los que hemos trabajado en la búsqueda de los desaparecidos. Somos mujeres quienes luchamos contra la militarización contra la militarización de las comunidades, y entonces también son mujeres las que encabezan todas las luchas también de los desplazados. Igual hemos sido mujeres las que hemos luchado contra la impunidad. Si hacemos memoria, generalmente pues el tema de las mujeres refugiadas también con Mamá Maquín, y bueno, así podemos enumerar. Yo creo que nadie ha escrito sobre el papel de las mujeres en la lucha por el genocidio. Hasta ahora como que se visualiza un poco más por los testimonios de mujeres en los tribunales, pero no es el fin, sino las mujeres desde el principio fuimos las que salimos a la calle para denunciar no solo las masacres, sino la búsqueda de familiares, porque al final eran mayormente hombres los desaparecidos, también los ejecutados extrajudicialmente. Entonces son las mujeres que ocupamos ese papel. Entonces es muy importante que, aunque no esté escrito, pero creo que esta conferencia pues también es muy importante que se resalte ese papel. Entonces, si uno ve, las mujeres han tenido pues constantemente una participación activa en hacer propuestas legislativas, en hacer propuestas de desarrollo, en creación de instituciones que se dediquen a la defensa de los derechos de las mujeres. En el caso de las mujeres mayas, hemos promovido tanto la institucionalidad de las mujeres. Uno es la Secretaría de la Mujer, que también el Foro Nacional de la Mujer, al igual como también la creación de la Defensoría de la Mujer Indígena. Y hemos también insistido en presupuestos nacionales, porque sin presupuesto estas instituciones no pueden hacer el trabajo pues de política pública a favor de las mujeres. Entonces, yo quisiera como un poco resaltar eso, el papel que las mujeres también hemos contribuido, no como una organización específica, sino como la lucha de las mujeres en las distintas como instituciones, pero todo apunta a señalar genocidio, a señalar que la tipificación de distintas etapas son, y por eso es que son tan dolorosas, porque, por ejemplo, hay en este caso del panel anterior sobre la identidad cultural, es algo que duele mucho, sobre todo para mujeres ancianas que perdieron su ropa, que perdieron la forma de tejer su huipil. Entonces, y eso no tiene reparación lamentablemente, pero que sí se puede agregar como un acto también de lesa humanidad, porque es parte de cultural y espiritual de nuestros pueblos.
Two rather brief questions. One, following up on the first question, on the issue of massacre, like I mentioned, I worked at the Truth Commission at the time in the 90s, and we struggled with that because there's no international definition for what constitutes a massacre. So I'm wondering if in the subsequent period of time, has there been some kind of agreement on what to call a massacre, or is it, as we considered at the time, an important cultural and social construct more than a legal or definitional construct? So that's one. But still the importance of labeling it, just because it doesn't exist in international law doesn't mean we don't label what happened a massacre. And we came up with a definition at the time. But and then the second one, I understand when we're working in the United States, we find ways to punish or use the law in our favor against those perpetrators in Guatemala. I have always wondered what happens when they're sent back. You know, is there a study being done, or academics or journalists or organizations following what happens? Do they continue to commit crimes elsewhere? Or what happens to perpetrators when they're sent back?
Maybe the first three.
Okay.
We've got enough follow. Then we'll move on to questions 4 through 7 after some reactions to 1 through 3.
No. You go. Does it?
Okay. I want to just stress that the work that I did was analyze the reports. So the words and the language is what the reports and the different reports used. So I wasn't analyzing, for example, what does massacre mean? We used massacre all the time in the early 80s. And the idea of genocide, I gave the idea that actually, now thinking about it, that actually genocide was being used in a slightly different way than it was. And I'm only referring to the period 82, 83, 84. That was what my report was about. So, también en relación con lo que dijo doña Rosalina, estoy totalmente de acuerdo con usted. Y eso es una de las lagunas de los informes, ¿no? Que invisibilizan a las mujeres. Claro, el último informe era 84. Yo creo que el GAM, si mal no me acuerdo, nació en 84, ¿no? Pero Conavivo nació en 87. Pero esta invisibilización de mujeres y que las mujeres solo son referidas en relación a violación sexual, en relación a viudas, es una forma de invisibilizar toda la agencia social. Yo sí traté, por eso escogí el testimonio de Carmelita Santos como el testimonio al inicio para mostrar esa agencia social de mujeres mayas, que fue desde el inicio. Pero lo que sí es un gran vacío desde los informes internacionales.
Y yo voy a agregar algo sobre el papel de la mujer en las organizaciones de refugiados y migrantes. Dos cosas. De lo que yo he visto, el liderazgo en México y Guatemala es principalmente de mujeres. En Estados Unidos, las organizaciones son lideradas por hombres, pero ha habido una lucha muy fuerte de parte de algunas mujeres de cambiar esta práctica porque se reproducen algunas de los problemas de prejuicios contra la mujer desde Guatemala, desde la izquierda de Guatemala hacia las organizaciones de migrantes y refugiados aquí en Estados Unidos, y es una lucha que sigue. La otra cosa es que si pensamos en dos seres, había inicialmente no 2, sino 5 sobrevivientes. 3 de ellos eran mujeres. ¿Qué pasó? Que las mujeres, niñas, todos eran niños, niñas. Las 3 muchachas fueron, ejecutados. Entonces solo quedaron los 2 muchachos, Oscar y Ramiro, para contar la historia aquí años, 30 y pico años después. Pero eso de 2 seres hubiera sido sobre mujeres también si no se hubieran ejecutados. And just going on to the question of what happens to those who are discovered in the United States when they're deported to Guatemala. This is a very counterintuitive fact that I'm going to mention, which is that ICE, the principal organ of deportation of the Department of Homeland Security, which has overseen the deportation of millions now, just under the Obama administration, and has been extremely harsh with women, especially. I mean, there's a protest going on now at the detention center in Berks, Pennsylvania, women who have been there for over a year when they're supposed to be held for no more than 20 days. Within all of that, believe it or not, ICE has a unit whereby they look for war criminals. And if they come across somebody, or there's a denuncia that somebody is here who committed war crimes before coming to the United States, they actually do try to find out what happened with these people. And so far, two of the victimarios in the Dos Eres cases have been identified. They're doing time now in the United States, but the ones who were undocumented were deported to Guatemala and are standing trial in the trial in Guatemala. So it's not like there have been dozens and dozens of these cases. It's just beginning. But I think the perspective we got last night is that, this is just the beginning. I mean, we certainly hope that's true, because as long as there are people with the energy to continue telling their stories and the drive to continue telling their stories, this is going to continue. And this is one of the things I find it was unthinkable in Guatemala, what's going on with the trials right now. At least for those of us who have studied Guatemala for a very long time, the trials is just like the uprising last year, is one of the things that was impensable antes. Okay.
So my question, just really briefly, is for Morna Macleod. And you mentioned that genocide is linked to sovereignty, but you didn't really kind of develop that because you ran out of time. So I'd love to hear more about what you want to say about that.
Hi, thank you both so much. Another question for Morna. Putting aside that very interesting British report, how do you explain the choices made in the framing of the other reports? You especially had a very interesting position there. In that moment, sometimes as interpreter, you knew very well what the NGOs or academics were hearing, and then you see what they decided to say. So how do you explain the sort of why the strategic choices made there about their framing of these events? And does it have anything to do with the fact that the leadership of the armed insurgency is also in Mexico City and shaping these debates in certain ways? So sort of what do you think about the why of all this?
I have a question that could get for both of you. It's looking to this aspect of the transnationalism and how far
Transnational.
Yes, or also international recognition have supported that, for example, nowhere or genocide in Guatemala became so silent, and people are not recognized as refugee, and they're not going to be also empowered to protest or talk about that. As soon as they're not recognized as refugees, they're not going to be feeling safe to talk about that and organize internationally. Is that maybe some of the reasons, some of the both sides of getting not recognized and on the other side as being silent internationally as well?
Sí, primero agradecer las dos presentaciones que han sido extraordinarias y además se han complementado muy bien. Y en primer lugar, tengo que repetir lo mismo para Morna, que desarrollaras más el término de genocidio vinculado a soberanía. Tal vez darte alguna pista en la medida que nosotros preparamos en ese entonces, en el 83, el Tribunal Permanente de los Pueblos. Entonces, los conceptos que nosotros cogimos o tomamos de genocidio estaban basados en el Tribunal del Elio Basso, en Italia, y sobre todo en el Tribunal de Bertrand Russell. Entonces, probablemente cogiendo, digamos, una conceptualización mucho más amplia, como la de Bertrand Russell, nos podía permitir esa, digamos, vinculación entre genocidio y soberanía, pero tal vez habría que trabajarla más para reconceptualizar el concepto. Y en segundo lugar, agradecer la ponencia de Susanne Jones, que ha sido extraordinaria, y pedirle que tal vez nos contara también cuáles son las redes sociales de apoyo y solidaridad que vienen trabajando en Estados Unidos, pero en Los Ángeles, para que nosotros tomáramos en cuenta cuáles son aquellas organizaciones que tienen un desarrollo histórico mayor y una credibilidad y una legitimidad mayor para el futuro trabajo de otros académicos aquí. Gracias.
Okay, so yes, exactly. Marta Casals explained in part the thing about, that was exactly where I took it from. With the Permanent People's Tribunal, which still continues, we had Mexico last year or the year before, they talk about the rights of people, of a people in plural, of people's rights, but plural. And so what I was thinking is that if you see Guatemala as a people, the idea of genocide goes beyond indigenous people and is applied to the Guatemalan people. That was what I think was very linked to the discourse that was being produced by Guatemalan organizations. So I think that is exactly, I was on the same track as you. In terms of what choices were made, I mean, I think first of all, you have to see which organizations they are. Amnesty International at that point, I remember because I lived in London till 82, was extremely careful. So the fact that they talk about 21 Indians killed and not a massacre, that was that moment in Amnesty International's life. It was at the beginning of Amnesty's life. I would say Amnesty's changed a lot over the years, over the decades, but that was at that beginning part. In the case of Trocaire, well, Trocaire was Catholic. You know, it was the delegation was led by a bishop. They talked to Ricardo Falla. They talked to, so that really, really made an impact on the way they framed. So I would say that they're not the only ones that made such an issue about Catholics being killed, but they also took Ricardo Falla and other, the priests in exile. They took that discourse, and there was a lot around indigenous people and peoples and culture there. The Segup were Guatemalan exiles, mainly Latino, but there was a strong influence, there you are, of the, as you say, the headquarters in Mexico City of a lot of the guerrilla organizations, and particularly one that gave a lot of emphasis to indigenous people, or two, but there's particularly one in that report. So each report has its own history and genealogies and ways of framing. So that I hope that answers that. I want to say before I forget, I have scanned about all these reports. I don't know if people have access to them or not. I have my own personal archive because I'm a hoarder, and I really want to share them with all of you. And that's why I put up my email address so that all of you, I'm giving a printed version to the Shoah Foundation, but I have digital copies for anyone who wants them, because I think these are parts of history that we don't want to have disappear. I'll leave the other questions to Susan.
Okay. Well, the first question was whether the transnationalism in some way contributed to the international community doing something, and I think so. I mean, I think just the growing presence of Guatemalans who had lived through all these experiences, as well as the fact that many people within those communities decided to make an issue of their past. I think that actually forced the international community, including, and I do want to speak particularly that it has impacted the U.S. government, which has a history of being completely in support of anything that the Guatemalan government does. And, during the struggle over that during the 1980s and 90s was very interesting to watch. I mean, culminating in Bill Clinton going to Guatemala and apologizing for the role the United States played in several decades worth of repression and training, and I mean that was. Nevertheless, those training programs continue. The U.S. government keeps trying to get them passed in Congress. There are some very heroic people in Congress who have kept alive the organizations, to counter those. But I think, yes, it's created a tremendous pressure on governments that were historically very favorable to Guatemalan governments, and particularly the U.S. government. And Marta, tu pregunta.
¿Cuáles son las redes, digamos, de solidaridad y las redes de migrantes más importantes de Guatemala que llevan a cabo más una lucha política que una lucha social, digamos, simplemente conseguir los papeles? Dentro de lo que tú conoces de Estados Unidos, que tienes una trayectoria de 30 años trabajando en ese tema, pues.
Bueno, sí, pues hay una variedad de redes que tiene su propia vida. Tenemos un capítulo en el libro que nada más traza la historia de estas redes y el surgimiento, que interesantemente no había redes de migrantes hasta terminar la guerra. Hubo instituciones de derechos humanos, pero organizarse como migrantes y refugiados, eso comenzó después de 96, no fue posible antes. Entonces, es decir que ahora tratamos de demostrar que la misma generación política que actuó dentro de Guatemala contra la violación de derechos humanos y que llevó esta lucha a Estados Unidos, después de la guerra se convirtió en los primeros grupos de guatemaltecos. Y pues importaron, yo diría, las fortalezas y las debilidades de la izquierda guatemalteca en este proceso. Más recientemente hay quienes no tienen hay nuevas generaciones que no tienen esta vinculación con la generación de los 80. Entonces, hay varias políticas, es una mezcla. Entonces tratamos de trazar en detalle cuáles son las diferencias. Ahora hay varias, pero la vanguardia de todo eso fue la izquierda guatemalteca.
Thank you. So we are almost out of time. The last question, but a tiny question, please. And we just saw that we had more than half of an hour, and it's still not enough with our subject. So nevertheless, we have to have a break. So the last question.
It's really not a question, but it's more as an immigrant who came in the 80s. I'm a survivor. And we did work very strongly in the Solidaridad movement in the 80s. We had to go through a lot of trauma. And even when we were here in the States, we were also persecuted. And we also had to hide being here. And we have friends that actually committed suicide here because they couldn't stand it. So it was not, and I don't think there's enough studies to really show what immigrants suffer here in the United States, trying to escape. And so I think it will be an encouragement also to do a little more studies about how we survivors are still able to keep up, adjust to the society, learn the language, continue with a life, and still be here trying to help our community. So I really thank you, and I really hope that you can take on this as well. Thanks.
So thanks a lot. We have now a 1.5 hour break. Please leave your headphones here. Don't take them. I have to say this every time now. And for the speaker.